A Tale of Werewolves, Alphas, and Fated Destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The iron cage smelled like rust and despair, and Celine Ashwood had learned over the past 2 weeks of captivity that those were scents you never quite got used to, no matter how many days you spent pressed against the cold metal bars, with your knees drawn up to your chest, because there wasn't enough room to stretch your legs properly. The merchant's wagon lurched over another rut in the muddy forest road, and she gripped the bars tighter to keep from being thrown against the 5 other Omegas who shared her prison. All of them silent now because they'd run out of tears days ago and run out of hope even before that. Rain hammered against the canvas covering above them, finding every gap and seam, dripping cold water onto their huddled forms until Celine's thin dress was soaked through and clinging to her skin like a second layer of misery. And her long, silver hair, once her mother's pride before it became a reminder of her strangeness, hung in tangled ropes down her back, the mud and grime dulling its unusual moonlight color to something closer to dirty dishwater. She was 24 years old, and she'd been sold by her own parents for 30 silver coins and 3 bags of grain, which was apparently the going rate for a defective Omega who couldn't give them grandchildren or enhance their family's standing in the pack. And the worst part? The part that made her chest ache with a pain that had nothing to do with the cold or the cramped conditions, was that she understood why they'd done it. Winter had been harsh that year in the River Bend Pack territory. Game was scarce, and stored supplies were running dangerously low. And when the traveling merchant Marcus had come through offering silver and goods in exchange for servants to sell in the northern territories, her parents had looked at their barren daughter, the girl who'd been examined by 3 different healers and declared infertile. The Omega who would never fulfill her biological purpose or attract a worthy mate, and they'd made a practical decision. Celine had seen it in her mother's eyes that last morning, that mixture of guilt and relief. The knowledge that they were doing something terrible, but also solving a problem that had weighed on them for 8 years, ever since the day after Celine's 16th birthday, when her first heat should have come and didn't, and every month after that, when her body remained stubbornly, inexplicably unchanged. The other Omegas in the cage were broken in different ways. Celine had learned during the long days of travel. Each one sold or abandoned because they'd failed to meet their pack's expectations in some fundamental manner. Lyra, the youngest at 19 with auburn hair and hazel eyes that had cried themselves dry within the first week, had been born with a twisted foot that made her limp, rendering her undesirable as a mate despite her sweet nature and beautiful singing voice. And she'd been given to Marcus by a father who had 6 other daughters and couldn't afford the dowry it would take to marry off a crippled one. Kira had lost her wolf in a rogue attack, surviving the assault, but emerging as something the pack considered neither fully human nor fully werewolf, trapped in a liminal state that made everyone uncomfortable. And her mate had rejected her publicly before the pack cast her out entirely. The others had similar stories, variations on the same cruel theme that Omegas were valued primarily for their wombs and their ability to strengthen pack bonds through advantageous matings, and if they couldn't fulfill those roles, they became expendable, burdensome, easier to sell off than to feed and shelter through lean times. Marcus kept them in cages because it was easier than dealing with escape attempts, though Celine couldn't imagine where any of them would run even if the opportunity presented itself, given that they were traveling through neutral wilderness territory, where rogues roamed freely, and a lone Omega wouldn't survive more than a day without pack protection. She'd heard him talking to his guards around the campfire on the nights when sleep wouldn't come, and she lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest beyond their prison, discussing where he planned to sell each of them, and for how much. His voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing livestock, rather than living, breathing women with hopes and fears and beating hearts. Lyra would go to a tavern in one of the mining towns, where her limp wouldn't matter as much as her pretty face and her ability to serve drinks in warm beds. Kira would probably end up in a textile mill, where her lack of wolf wouldn't be a disadvantage when working the looms 16 hours a day. And Celine, he'd said with a laugh that made her stomach turn, would fetch a decent price from the mountain mining operations because her silver hair and pale skin would appeal to the more superstitious foreman, who believed unusual-looking omegas brought good luck to dangerous work. And her infertility meant they wouldn't have to worry about lost productivity due to pregnancy or heat cycles. The thought of spending the rest of her life deep underground in some dark mine shaft, never seeing sunlight or touching growing things, never working with the medicinal herbs that had been her only solace during the years after her diagnosis, made something in Celine's chest constrict so tightly she could barely breathe. But she'd learned not to show fear or pain where Marcus could see it, because he fed on those emotions, like a predator scenting blood. So she kept her face blank and her eyes downcast and let the rain wash over her like a cold baptism into whatever new hell awaited her at the end of this journey. She'd spent the first few days of captivity bargaining with the moon goddess in desperate, silent prayers, promising to be better, to accept her fate without complaint, to serve whatever purpose was asked of her, if only she could be spared the worst of what was coming. But the moon goddess remained as silent as she'd been for the past 8 years, ever since Celine had prayed for her first heat to come and prove she wasn't broken. And eventually she'd stopped praying altogether, because what was the point of begging for mercy from a deity who'd already made it clear that Celine Ashwood was not among her blessed children? The wagon jerked to a sudden stop, so abrupt that Celine was thrown forward against the bars hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs, and she heard Marcus shouting something from the driver's seat, his voice sharp with alarm rather than his usual cruel amusement, which sent a spike of fear through her chest, because if something had scared Marcus, it must be truly dangerous. The other Omegas whimpered and pressed closer together, seeking comfort in proximity, even though they were all equally helpless. And Celine found herself reaching for Lyra's hand without conscious thought, squeezing the younger girl's cold fingers as the sound of running footsteps and shouted orders filtered through the canvas covering, along with something else, something that made every instinct Celine possessed scream a warning she couldn't quite interpret. The unmistakable sound of wolves growling, deep and resonant and filled with lethal promise, erupted from somewhere close by, followed by Marcus's guards yelling challenges and threats. And then the clash of fighting, snarls, and screams mixing with the sound of rain and thunder until Celine couldn't tell where one ended and another began. And all she could do was huddle in her cage, with her fingers locked around Lyra's hand, and pray that whatever was happening out there would be over quickly, one way or another. The wagon tipped sideways without warning, the entire structure groaning and then crashing onto its side with the impact that sent all 6 Omegas tumbling against the bars in a tangle of limbs and panicked cries. And Celine felt her shoulder slam into the iron with bruising force, even as she tried to shield Lyra with her own body, operating on instinct rather than rational thought, because protecting others had always been her first response, even when she couldn't protect herself. The canvas covering tore away, ripped off by wind or claws or something else, and suddenly, cold rain was pouring directly into their cage, mixing with the mud that splattered through the bars, and Celine could see glimpses of the chaos outside through the gaps in the iron, flashes of white fur and silver eyes, and movements too fast to track properly. The kind of speed and coordination that spoke of trained warriors rather than common rogues, which made no sense because what would elite fighters be doing ambushing a merchant caravan in neutral territory? The wagon door heavy wood reinforced with iron bands that Marcus had always locked with 3 separate mechanisms because he was paranoid about his merchandise escaping, was suddenly ripped away entirely, torn from its hinges with a shriek of protesting metal, and Celine's breath caught in her throat as a massive white wolf appeared in the opening, so large it barely fit through the frame, with thick fur that seemed to glow even in the dim light, and eyes the color of glacial ice that swept over the huddled omegas with an intensity that made Celine feel simultaneously terrified and inexplicably safe. Those ice-blue eyes locked onto her, and in that moment, that single suspended heartbeat where the world seemed to hold its breath, Celine felt something snap into place in her chest, a warmth that spread through her cold, aching body like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, a pull toward this massive predator that should have terrified her, but instead made her want to reach out, to touch, to understand what this feeling was that had her heart racing and her skin tingling, and her entire being leaning toward the wolf as though drawn by invisible strings she'd never known existed. The wolf made a sound low in its throat, not quite a growl, but something deeper, more complex, and it moved closer to the cage with careful, deliberate steps, its gaze never leaving Celine's face, and she found she couldn't look away even though every survival instinct she possessed should have been screaming at her to make herself small and non-threatening in the presence of such obvious predatory power. There was intelligence in those pale blue eyes, awareness and recognition that went beyond simple animal cunning, and Celine knew with absolute certainty that this was no ordinary wolf, but a shifter of significant rank. Probably an alpha given the size and bearing and the way other white wolves were appearing behind him, all of them deferring to his presence with subtle shifts in posture that spoke of ingrained hierarchy and unquestioned authority. She should have been terrified, should have been pressing herself against the back of the cage and whimpering like the other omegas who were crying and trembling against the far bars. But instead, she found herself moving forward, her fingers reaching through the iron toward this impossible creature, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, but that made her chest ache with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Behind the massive white wolf, Celine could see that the fighting had stopped. Marcus and his guards subdued and bound, their faces bloody and their eyes wide with fear, as more white wolves emerged from the forest, moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. And she realized this hadn't been a random attack by rogues, but a planned operation by someone with significant resources and training. Someone who had known about this merchant caravan and decided to intervene. Though she couldn't begin to imagine why anyone would bother rescuing a cage full of defective omegas unless there was some profit in it that Marcus hadn't considered. The white wolf at the cage door made a soft, chuffing sound, almost gentle, and then it was backing away, its form blurring in that distinctive shimmer that accompanied a shift from wolf to human form. And Celine's breath caught as a man appeared where the wolf had been, tall and powerfully built with silver hair that fell past his shoulders in waves that matched the color of her own rain-soaked locks, and eyes still that same piercing ice blue that had looked at her with such startling intensity. He was bare-chested, muscles defined under pale skin, marked with scars that spoke of battles survived. And one of the other wolves, a slightly smaller white beast, approached carrying clothes in its jaws, dropping them at the silver-haired man's feet with the kind of trained obedience that confirmed Celine's suspicion about this being an organized operation rather than a random encounter. The man dressed quickly, pulling on dark pants and a shirt, while never taking his eyes off the cage, off Celine specifically. And when he was decent, he moved forward again, kneeling in the mud beside the overturned wagon, so his face was level with hers through the bars, and up close she could see he was perhaps 28 or 30 years old, with aristocratic features and an air of command that made it clear he was someone important, someone powerful, someone who absolutely should not be kneeling in the rain, looking at a worthless Omega slave like she was something precious he'd been searching for his entire life. His hand reached out slowly, carefully, stopping just short of touching the bars where her fingers still gripped the cold iron. And when he spoke, his voice was deep and rough with emotion she couldn't identify, asking her a single question that would change the entire trajectory of her existence in ways she couldn't possibly comprehend in that moment. Surrounded by mud and rain and the wreckage of her former captivity, with the strange warmth in her chest growing stronger with every second she held his gaze and wondered why this powerful stranger was looking at her like she mattered, like she was someone worth rescuing, like her broken, barren, worthless self was exactly what he'd been hoping to find in a cage on a muddy forest road in the middle of a storm that showed no signs of letting up. "What's your name?" he asked, and the way he said it, gentle but intense, as though her answer was the most important thing he'd ever heard, made Celine's throat tighten with the first real emotion besides numbness she'd felt since her parents had sold her. And she found herself whispering her response through the bars. Her voice barely audible over the rain, but clearly heard by this silver-haired stranger, whose eyes widened slightly when she spoke, as though her name confirmed something he'd suspected, answered some question he'd been asking for far longer than the few minutes since he'd ripped open her cage and looked at her like she was worth saving instead of selling. And Celine had no idea what any of this meant or why it was happening, but she knew with bone-deep certainty that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't begin to predict. And whatever came next, it would be nothing like the dark mine shaft Marcus had planned for her future. The name left her lips like a prayer she'd forgotten how to speak, barely more than a whisper that somehow carried through the storm and the chaos and the distance between them. And when she said, "Celine," watching his ice-blue eyes darken with recognition and something else, something that looked almost like relief mixed with wonder, she felt the warmth in her chest flare brighter, spreading through her limbs like liquid sunlight, melting the numbness that had kept her functioning through 2 weeks of captivity and years of believing she was fundamentally broken in ways that could never be repaired. He repeated her name, his voice wrapping around each syllable with a reverence that made no sense, given that she was a muddy, bedraggled Omega in a cage, and he was clearly someone of significant rank and power. And then he was moving, gesturing to the other white wolves who immediately set to work opening the cage with an efficiency that suggested they'd done this before, had rescued other captives from other merchant caravans. And Celine wondered with a detached sort of curiosity if this was something they did regularly or if this particular intervention had been planned specifically, though she couldn't imagine why anyone would plan a military operation to rescue a cargo of defective Omegas unless there was some angle she wasn't seeing. The cage door swung open with a screech of protesting hinges, and the silver-haired man reached in, his large hand extended toward her in clear invitation. And Celine found herself hesitating, even though every instinct was screaming at her to take his hand, to accept whatever rescue he was offering, because 8 years of being told she was worthless had taught her to be suspicious of kindness, to look for the hidden cost, to understand that nothing came without a price. And beautiful silver-haired men with eyes like winter storms definitely didn't kneel in the mud offering their hands to broken Omegas without expecting something substantial in return. She could feel the other captives watching her. Lyra's fingers still gripped tight in her own, and she realized they were all waiting to see what she would do. whether she would trust this stranger, or whether the fear that had kept them compliant in Marcus's cages would keep them paralyzed, even when the door stood open and freedom was being offered on a silver platter by a man whose very presence made the air feel charged with electricity and possibility. "You're safe now," the silver-haired man said, his voice pitched low and soothing like he was gentling a frightened animal, which perhaps wasn't far from the truth given how Celine's heart was racing, and her breathing had gone shallow, and her entire body was trembling with a combination of cold and shock, and that strange warmth that kept pulling her toward him like a moon-pulled tide. "All of you are safe. I give you my word that no one will hurt you, or force you, or sell you. You have my personal protection and the protection of my guard. And once we get you somewhere warm and dry, we can discuss what happens next. But right now, I need you to trust me enough to take my hand and let me help you out of this cage because you're all half frozen and soaked through. And if we don't get you to shelter soon, hypothermia is going to become a serious concern." His words were practical and reassuring, but it was the way he looked at Celine specifically when he spoke about trust. The way his hand remained extended toward her and no one else, that made her realize he wasn't just offering rescue to a group of captive Omegas. He was offering something more personal to her specifically, though what that could possibly be she had no framework for understanding. Celine made her decision without fully understanding why, releasing Lyra's hand with a gentle squeeze of reassurance and reaching out to place her mud-stained fingers in the stranger's much larger palm, feeling calluses that spoke of weapons training and hard work despite his obvious rank. And the moment their skin made contact, the warmth in her chest exploded into something so intense she gasped audibly, her eyes widening as she felt a connection snap into place between them. Invisible but undeniable, a golden thread that seemed to link her heart to his in ways that made absolutely no sense, but felt more real than anything she'd experienced in years of lonely isolation within her own pack. His fingers closed around hers with exquisite gentleness, as though she were made of spun glass, instead of the durable flesh and bone that had survived 2 weeks in a cage and years of emotional neglect. And he helped her navigate the awkward climb out of the overturned wagon, his other hand coming to steady her waist when she stumbled on legs that had gone half numb from prolonged cramping. And the casual touch sent another wave of that inexplicable warmth through her system, making her acutely aware of every point of contact between their bodies in ways that felt both completely inappropriate and utterly natural. Once she was on solid ground, muddy though it was, the silver-haired man turned his attention to helping the other Omegas out of the cage, offering the same gentle assistance to each one, while maintaining a professional distance that he notably hadn't maintained with Celine. And she found herself standing slightly apart from the group, watching as he and his guards, who had shifted to human form and were now clothed in simple but well-made garments, systematically freed all 6 captives and gathered them together under the shelter of several large trees whose canopy provided minimal protection from the ongoing storm, but was better than standing completely exposed. Marcus and his men were being secured with professional efficiency by several of the guards, their weapons confiscated and their hands bound behind their backs, and Celine heard Marcus shouting something about property rights and legal purchases, his voice carrying that particular whining tone of someone who knew they were in serious trouble, but was desperately trying to bluff their way out of consequences. The silver-haired man, who still hadn't introduced himself beyond that soul-deep exchange of her name, walked over to where Marcus was being restrained, and Celine watched as his entire demeanor shifted from the gentle rescuer who'd helped her from the cage to something darker and infinitely more dangerous, his shoulders squaring and his jaw tightening and his eyes going cold in a way that made her grateful that particular expression wasn't directed at her. "You're operating a slave trade in neutral territory, trafficking in omegas who were either sold under duress or taken without consent, and you're transporting them in conditions that violate every treaty regarding humane treatment of captives," he said, his voice carrying an authority that made it clear he wasn't just some random good Samaritan, but someone with actual legal standing to make these accusations stick. "By the laws that govern these lands and the treaties signed by every major pack in the Northern Territories, I'm well within my rights to execute you and your men immediately for these crimes. But I'm going to be merciful and simply ensure you never operate in this region again, which means you'll be escorted to the nearest pack border and banned from entering any territory under Northern jurisdiction. And if you're ever caught trafficking omegas again, the mercy I'm showing today will be permanently revoked." Marcus's face went pale, then red, then pale again as the implications sank in, and he started sputtering protests about lost investments and damaged merchandise, referring to the 6 freed omegas as though they were broken furniture rather than living beings. And Celine felt something cold settle in her stomach as she listened to him reduce their collective worth to monetary values and damaged goods. Because it was one thing to know intellectually that she'd been sold as property, and quite another to hear someone discussing her in those terms while she stood right there, muddy and shivering, but undeniably human, undeniably deserving of basic dignity, even if she was broken and barren and fundamentally flawed in the ways that mattered to pack hierarchy. The silver-haired man's expression went from cold to absolutely glacial, and he took a step closer to Marcus that had the merchant flinching backward despite being held firmly by 2 guards. And when he spoke again, his voice was soft, in a way that was somehow more threatening than if he'd been shouting. Each word precisely enunciated and dripping with barely controlled rage that suggested violence was a very real possibility if Marcus said one more stupid thing. "Those women," he said, gesturing toward where Celine and the others huddled together under the trees, "are not merchandise. They are not property. They are living, breathing people who deserve respect and care and the freedom to determine their own futures. And the fact that you can't see that you genuinely believe monetary compensation is the relevant concern in this situation, tells me everything I need to know about why you chose this particular line of work." He paused, letting the words sink in, and then added with a tone that brooked absolutely no argument. "My guards will take you and your men to the border. You'll be released with enough supplies to reach the nearest settlement. And you should count yourself extraordinarily fortunate that I'm feeling generous today, because my first instinct was to let my wolves tear out your throat for caging helpless omegas like animals. And it's only the fact that we're trying to maintain some semblance of civilized law in these territories that's keeping you breathing. So I suggest you take this second chance and use it to find a new profession that doesn't involve exploiting vulnerable people for profit." Celine watched as Marcus and his guards were led away by several of the white wolves who had shifted back to their animal forms, their massive bodies and coordinated movements making it abundantly clear that any attempt at escape would be both futile and fatal. And she felt a complicated mix of relief that her captor was being removed from the picture and anxiety about what would happen next. Because rescue was wonderful in theory, but she had no idea what these people wanted from her and the other omegas, whether they had their own agenda that would simply replace one form of captivity with another. And the cynical part of her that had been forged through years of disappointment and rejection whispered that kindness always came with strings attached, that nothing was ever truly free, that she should be preparing herself for whatever price would eventually be demanded for this rescue. The silver-haired man returned to where the 6 omegas were gathered, his expression softening again as he approached, and he addressed them as a group, though his eyes kept returning to Celine with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness, and something else, something that felt dangerously close to the kind of attraction she'd given up hoping to experience after her third rejected courtship attempt had ended with her potential suitor literally laughing at the idea of mating with a barren Omega who couldn't even fulfill the most basic biological function of her designation. I know you're all frightened and confused, and you have every right to be after what you've been through, he said, his voice gentle again, the rage he'd directed at Marcus completely absent from his tone now. My name is Theron, and I lead a territory north of here where you'll all be welcome to stay for as long as you need. Whether that's a few days while you recover and decide where you want to go next, or permanently if you choose to make it your home, the decision is entirely yours, and there are no strings attached to this offer. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, and Celine found herself cataloging details about him almost unconsciously. The way he stood with unconscious authority, but without aggression. The silver hair that was so similar to her own that it created an almost mirror-like effect when she caught glimpses of her reflection in puddles. The scars that marked him as a warrior, but the gentleness that marked him as something more than just a fighter. I understand if you don't trust me. Trust is earned, and I'm a stranger who appeared out of a storm and dismantled your captivity, which probably feels surreal and possibly suspicious. But I give you my word as an alpha and a leader that you're under my protection now. No one will force you to do anything you don't want to do, and you'll be treated with the respect and dignity that every person deserves, regardless of their past or their designation, or whatever circumstances led to you being in those cages. The word alpha sent a shock through Celine's system because she'd suspected he was high-ranking, but an alpha was someone with serious power and authority. Someone who could make the kinds of promises he was making and actually have the resources to back them up, and it explained the deference his guards showed him and the confidence with which he dismantled Marcus's operation, and the way he carried himself like someone who'd never had to question whether his commands would be obeyed. Lyra was the first to speak, her voice small and hesitant, but brave in its own way, asking the question they were all thinking but had been too afraid to voice. Why did you rescue us, if there's nothing you want from us in return, if we're really free to leave whenever we want? Then why go through all this trouble for 6 defective Omegas that our own packs didn't want? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with years of accumulated rejection and learned worthlessness, and Celine held her breath waiting for Theron's answer. Because this was the crucial moment. This was where he'd reveal whatever hidden agenda was driving his generosity. And she braced herself for disappointment, for the inevitable letdown when his kindness proved to be just another transaction with a price she couldn't afford to pay. Theron's expression shifted to something that looked almost like pain, as though Lyra's question had physically hurt him, and when he answered, his voice was thick with emotion that seemed genuine, though Celine's battered trust made it hard to accept that anyone with his kind of power would genuinely care about the welfare of disposable Omegas. You're not defective, he said, looking at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering longest on Celine in a way that made her pulse race and her breath catch. You're people who've been failed by the very communities that should have protected you. You've been judged by arbitrary standards and discarded when you didn't fit narrow definitions of acceptable or useful, but that says everything about the failures of your former packs and nothing about your actual worth as individuals. He took a breath, running a hand through his wet silver hair in a gesture that seemed unconscious and oddly vulnerable. I'm dismantling slave operations in this region because trafficking in people is abhorrent and illegal, and I have the resources and the authority to stop it, so I do. It's that simple. There's no hidden agenda or expectation of repayment. You don't owe me anything for doing what any decent person with power should do, when they encounter injustice. The sincerity in his voice was almost painful to hear, and Celine felt something cracking in her chest, some defensive wall she'd built around her heart to survive years of being unwanted and undervalued, and she wanted desperately to believe him, to trust that rescue could be genuine and kindness could exist without ulterior motives. But the fear of disappointment, of letting herself hope only to have that hope crushed again, made her hesitate even as her entire being was drawn toward this silver-haired alpha who looked at her like she mattered, like she was someone worth saving, like her brokenness wasn't the most important thing about her. Theron's guards brought horses forward, enough for everyone, and he explained they had a 3-day journey ahead to reach his territory, that they'd stop at safe locations along the way to rest and eat and let everyone recover from their ordeal, and that he understood if they were nervous about traveling with strangers, but hoped they'd give him the chance to prove his intentions were honorable. And Celine found herself nodding along with the others, accepting the reality that they had few other options, and this alpha had at least proven he was willing to stand against injustice, even if his ultimate motivations remained unclear. As Theron helped her mount behind one of his guards, a massive man named Brennan, who radiated protective energy and handled her with the same careful gentleness his alpha had shown. Celine caught Theron's eye across the small clearing they'd reorganized into something resembling a traveling party, and the look that passed between them was electric with unspoken recognition, with that strange warmth that kept building in her chest whenever he was near, with possibilities she didn't dare name because hoping for connection, for belonging, for someone to see value in her broken self, had only ever led to pain and rejection and the crushing weight of disappointment. They began moving through the forest, following paths only Theron and his guards seemed to know. And Celine tried to focus on practical concerns like how cold she was and how much her body ached from weeks of confinement, rather than the way her eyes kept seeking out the silver-haired alpha who rode at the front of their group, whose presence she could feel even when she couldn't see him, whose kindness terrified her almost as much as Marcus's cruelty had, because at least with cruelty, she knew what to expect, knew how to protect herself, knew that hoping for better would only make the inevitable hurt worse. They rode for hours through deteriorating weather, the storm intensifying rather than breaking, and by the time Theron called a halt to make camp for the night, Celine was so cold and exhausted she could barely stay upright, her fingers numb where they gripped Brennan's coat, and her entire body shaking with tremors that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with exposure and fatigue and the accumulated trauma of weeks in captivity. Theron appeared at her side as Brennan helped her dismount, his hands steadying her when her legs threatened to give out completely, and she felt that warmth flare again at his touch, cutting through the cold and exhaustion like a beacon of heat in a frozen landscape. And when she looked up into his ice-blue eyes, she saw concern there, genuine worry for her well-being that made absolutely no sense, but felt more real than anything she'd experienced in the 8 years since her diagnosis had marked her as fundamentally flawed. "You're frozen through," he said, his voice tight with worry as he assessed her condition with eyes that missed nothing. And before she could protest, or pull away, or remind him that broken omegas didn't deserve this kind of attention from powerful alphas, he was shrugging off his own dry cloak, the one that had been protected by oiled canvas during the ride, and wrapping it around her shoulders, the fabric still warm from his body heat, and carrying a scent that made her wolf, silent and dormant for so many years, she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to sense her other half, suddenly stir with interest and recognition that sent a jolt of pure shock through her entire system. Her wolf had never reacted to anyone, Not in 8 years of failed courtships and rejected attempts at connection. Not even during the week before her parents sold her, when a visiting alpha had expressed mild interest, before learning of her infertility and moving on to more viable prospects. But now, wrapped in Theron's cloak and standing close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, her wolf was pressing against her consciousness with an urgency that felt like waking up after years of sleep, like coming alive after existing in stasis, like recognizing something essential that had been missing without her even realizing there was an absence to notice. Theron was watching her face with an expression she couldn't quite read, something intense and searching and almost hopeful. And she wondered if he could sense her wolf's reaction, if his own wolf was responding in kind, if the warmth between them was something more than just residual adrenaline and rescue-based gratitude. But before she could process any of those thoughts or figure out what to say or do with this overwhelming surge of sensations and emotions she thought herself incapable of experiencing, one of the guards called out a warning that made every wolf in their party go instantly alert, and Theron's expression shifted from gentle concern to lethal focus as he turned to face the new threat emerging from the darkening forest. And Celine felt her briefly awakened hope freeze in her chest as she recognized the wolves stepping into their makeshift camp, their eyes gleaming with malicious intent, and their numbers suggesting this wasn't a random encounter, but a planned ambush, and the lead wolf, a scarred gray beast with cruel yellow eyes, shifted to human form and smiled at Theron with the kind of vicious anticipation that promised violence and chaos. And Celine realized with sinking horror that their rescue might have been premature, that safety was still very far away, and that whatever was about to happen would determine whether she survived long enough to understand what this silver-haired alpha meant when he looked at her like she was precious, like she was wanted, like she was worth fighting for, even though every part of her broken self insisted that was impossible. The gray wolf's human form was even more menacing than his animal shape, all scarred muscle and predatory confidence. And when he spoke, his voice carried the rough edge of someone who'd spent years surviving through violence and intimidation, rather than any civilized form of pack hierarchy. "Well, well, Alpha King Theron Wintercrest himself, out here in the wilderness playing hero to a bunch of worthless Omega trash. And here, I thought the rumors about the great king going soft were exaggerated, but clearly, you've lost your edge if you're wasting resources rescuing slaves that even their own packs didn't want to keep." The words hit Celine like physical blows, each casual cruelty a reminder of everything she'd tried to forget during the past few hours of hoping that maybe, just maybe, she'd found someone who saw her differently. But the designation Alpha King ricocheted through her mind with shocking implications because Theron wasn't just an alpha. He was the Alpha King, ruler of the Northern Crown Kingdom, the most powerful werewolf in the entire Northern Territories, and suddenly, his silver hair and commanding presence, and the deference his elite guards showed him, made terrible, wonderful, completely overwhelming sense. Theron moved with fluid grace to position himself between the rogue wolves and the rescued Omegas, his 12 elite guards flanking him in a defensive formation that spoke of years of training and absolute trust. And when he responded to the gray wolf's taunts, his voice was cold and precise, carrying the kind of authority that came from never doubting his right to command. "Garrett, I should have known you'd be stupid enough to attack a royal convoy. But I suppose desperation makes people do foolish things, especially when they're leading a dying pack of rogues who've been pushed out of every legitimate territory in the North, because your idea of leadership involves terrorizing the weak instead of actually building something worth protecting." The name Garrett sent another shock through Celine's system because she knew that name, had heard it whispered in her old pack with a mixture of fear and disgust. the rogue Alpha who'd been banished from 3 different territories for brutality, and who now led a group of outcasts who survived through raids and violence, and the fact that he'd chosen to attack Theron's group suggested either incredible stupidity or desperate circumstances that made the risk seem worthwhile. Garrett's expression twisted with rage at Theron's casual dismissal, and he gestured to the wolves behind him, at least 20 of them emerging from the forest shadows with coordinated timing that suggested they'd been tracking Theron's group for hours, waiting for the right moment to strike when everyone was tired and vulnerable from the long day of travel. "You're 12 pretty white wolves against my 20 battle-hardened fighters, and you're protecting 6 useless Omegas who'll slow you down and divide your attention, so I like my odds here, Wintercrest. Especially since all I have to do is keep you busy long enough to grab a few of those Omegas and disappear back into the wilderness, because there's always a market for Omega slaves even if they're defective, and Marcus was a business partner of mine who you just cost a significant amount of money. So consider this collecting on a debt while also reminding you that your authority doesn't extend everywhere, that there are still places in these territories where your crown means nothing and strength is the only currency that matters." The casual way he discussed kidnapping them, as though the 6 women huddled behind Theron's protective line were nothing more than commodities to be stolen and sold, made Celine's stomach turn with a mixture of fear and rage because she'd just escaped one captor, and the thought of being dragged back into captivity by someone even worse than Marcus was almost more than her battered psyche could handle. Theron's laugh was dark and entirely without humor, and Celine watched as his entire demeanor shifted into something that reminded her why Alpha Kings earned their titles through more than just political maneuvering, why people spoke his name with respect and fear, why his presence commanded immediate obedience even from warriors who'd spent their lives training for combat. "You're making the fatal mistake of confusing numbers with actual fighting capability, Garrett. Because my guards aren't just any wolves. They're the royal elite who've trained since childhood specifically to protect the crown and handle threats like you. And the fact that you think 20 rogues with no real tactical training or pack cohesion can overwhelm 12 of the finest warriors in the Northern Territories tells me everything I need to know about why you keep losing territory and followers." He paused, and something in his ice-blue eyes shifted to a predatory gleam that made even Garrett take an involuntary step backward. "But here's what's really going to happen. You're going to take your ragged pack of criminals and disappear back into whatever hole you crawled out of. And in exchange, I won't have my guards tear you apart and leave your bodies for the scavengers. Because I'm trying to have a peaceful evening with people who've already been through enough trauma without adding graphic violence to their experience. But if you insist on pushing this, if you take even one step toward these Omegas, I will personally ensure that you regret every decision that led you to this moment. And that's not a threat, Garrett. That's a promise from someone who has both the power and the motivation to follow through." The tension in the clearing was suffocating. Every wolf on both sides coiled and ready for violence, and Celine found herself gripping Theron's cloak tighter around her shoulders, the fabric that smelled like him and still held his warmth, feeling like the only solid thing in a world that had gone dangerously unstable. And she realized with startling clarity that she didn't want Theron to fight for her, didn't want him to risk himself for a broken Omega he'd just met, didn't want to be the cause of violence and bloodshed, even though the protective instinct that had him standing between her and danger made something in her chest ache with emotions she'd thought herself incapable of feeling. Garrett was clearly weighing his options, his yellow eyes darting between Theron's confident stance and his own fighters, who were starting to look less certain about their numerical advantage. And Celine could see the moment he made his decision, the subtle shift in his posture that preceded action. But before he could give the order to attack, before the clearing could erupt into the violence that seemed inevitable, something extraordinary happened that changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation in ways no one could have predicted. Celine felt her wolf surge forward with unprecedented strength, breaking through the barriers that had kept her dormant for 8 years, and she shifted without conscious thought or control. Her human form dissolving into her wolf shape for the first time since her 16th birthday. And the transformation was so unexpected, so completely impossible given her diagnosis and her years of inability to shift properly, that everyone in the clearing froze in stunned silence. Her wolf was smaller than the others, delicate and clearly omega in her build, but her fur was pure silver, so bright it seemed to glow even in the dim evening light, and her eyes had shifted from gray to molten silver that reflected the rising moon, with an intensity that made several of the rogues take involuntary steps backward, because silver wolves were legend, were myth, were the mark of moon goddess blessings so rare that most modern wolves had never seen one in their lifetime, and the fact that this supposedly broken, barren, worthless omega had just shifted into a form that proclaimed her as someone touched by divine favor made everything Garrett had said about her being trash sound not just cruel, but cosmically, fundamentally wrong. Theron made a sound low in his throat that was part wonder and part something deeper, more primal, and Celine felt his eyes on her transformed shape with an intensity that made her wolf preen, even as her human consciousness struggled to process what had just happened, struggled to understand how she'd shifted when she hadn't been able to for years, struggled to reconcile her silver fur with the diagnosis that had defined her entire adult life. The moon broke through the storm clouds at that exact moment, as though responding to her transformation, bathing the clearing in silvery light that made her fur shimmer and glow. And Theron shifted as well, his human form flowing into a massive silver-white wolf that was easily twice her size. His ice-blue eyes locked onto her smaller form with recognition and claiming and absolute certainty. And even in her shocked state, Celine understood what was happening, understood what the warmth in her chest and the pull between them and her wolf's sudden awakening all meant, understood that Theron Wintercrest, Alpha King of the Northern Crown, was her mate, her true mate, the one her body had been waiting for through 8 years of dormancy and perceived brokenness. Garrett must have sensed the shift in power dynamics, must have recognized that attacking a silver wolf, who was clearly the Alpha King's mate, would bring down consequences far worse than anything Theron had threatened, because he was backing away with his rogues following suit. Their earlier bravado completely evaporated in the face of moon goddess intervention, and the clear evidence that these weren't just random rescued omegas, but someone precious enough to warrant divine protection. "This isn't over, Wintercrest," Garrett snarled, but there was no real conviction in his voice, just the empty posturing of someone who'd lost badly and needed to save face before retreating. "You can't protect everyone, and eventually your luck will run out." Theron's responding growl was dismissive, clearly communicating that Garrett's threats held no weight, and his presence was no longer even worth acknowledging. And within moments, the rogue pack had melted back into the forest, their retreat hasty and complete, leaving Theron's group alone in the clearing with the moon shining down and Celine still trying to process the reality of standing on 4 legs for the first time in 8 years. She shifted back to human form awkwardly, the transformation rusty from disuse, and found herself naked except for Theron's cloak, which Lyra had quickly grabbed and was holding out to her with the expression of awe and excitement that suggested her friend understood the significance of what had just happened, even if Celine herself was still struggling to accept it. Theron shifted back as well, one of his guards immediately providing him with clothes, and he approached Celine with reverent slowness, as though afraid sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile magic had allowed this moment to occur. And when he spoke, His voice was rough with emotion that he wasn't even trying to hide anymore. "You're moon-blessed," he said, and the way he said it, with wonder and certainty, and something that sounded almost like gratitude, made Celine's eyes fill with tears she'd been holding back for hours, for days, for years. "Your wolf was dormant because she was waiting for me, for her mate, and everything your pack told you about being broken was a lie. You were never infertile or defective. You were just waiting for the right person, and I've been searching for you for so long, following my mother's prophecy about a mate marked by silver moonlight. And I found you in a cage covered in mud, but I knew, the moment I saw you, I knew you were mine, that we were meant for each other, that the moon goddess had led me to that merchant caravan specifically so I could find you." The words should have been overwhelming, should have been too much too fast after everything she'd been through, but instead, they felt like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place, like answers to questions she'd been asking her entire life without knowing how to articulate them. And Celine found herself moving toward Theron without conscious decision, drawn by the mate bond that was singing between them now that her wolf had awakened and recognized him. "I don't understand," she whispered, even as her body and soul were telling her she understood perfectly that this silver-haired Alpha King was hers, and she was his, and everything that had seemed broken about her had actually been a gift she hadn't learned to recognize. "My parents sold me because I couldn't have children. The healers examined me and said my womb was barren. How can I be moon-blessed when I'm fundamentally unable to fulfill the most basic purpose of an Omega?" The pain in her voice was years in the making, accumulated grief and shame, and internalized worthlessness, and Theron's expression shifted to something fierce and protective as he closed the remaining distance between them and took her face gently between his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes and see the absolute conviction burning there. Those healers were wrong, spectacularly, catastrophically wrong, because moon-blessed Omegas don't experience heat cycles or fertility until they meet their true mate. It's the rarest gift the moon goddess gives, a guarantee that you'll only ever bear children with the person you're destined for. And I know this because my mother was a seer who told me about it, who prophesied that I would find a moon-blessed mate marked by silver hair and moonlight, and I've been searching for 5 years through every pack and territory trying to find you. His thumbs brushed away the tears that were streaming down her face now, and his smile was gentle and understanding and full of a tenderness that made her chest ache. "Your parents didn't sell you because you were worthless. They sold you because they were ignorant and cruel and couldn't see the treasure they had. But the moon goddess used even their cruelty to bring you to me, to put you in that cage on that road at exactly the right time for me to find you. And I know it doesn't erase the pain of what you've been through, but I promise you that from this moment forward, you'll never again question your worth or your value or your right to be cherished exactly as you are." Celine broke down completely then, years of suppressed grief and shame and loneliness pouring out in racking sobs that Theron absorbed without complaint, simply holding her and letting her cry against his chest while his hands stroked her silver hair and his voice murmured reassurances that she was safe now, wanted now, home now, even though they were standing in a forest clearing and hadn't even reached his territory yet. Because home wasn't a place, it was this person, this connection, this feeling of being seen and valued and chosen, not despite her perceived flaws, but including all of them. The other rescued Omegas were watching with expressions ranging from joy to wistfulness, and Lyra was openly crying happy tears at seeing her friend found by her mate, and the elite guards were maintaining respectful distances, but she could see small smiles on their normally stoic faces, genuine pleasure at their king finding his prophesied queen. And Celine realized that this moment, this impossible, beautiful, overwhelming moment was real, was happening, was hers to claim if she could find the courage to believe she deserved it. When her tears finally subsided, Theron pulled back just enough to look at her properly, his ice-blue eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and cherished. "I know this is fast. I know you need time to heal from everything you've been through. And I'm not asking you to accept the mate bond immediately or make any decisions before you're ready," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But I want you to know that you have a home in my territory, a place in my palace, and when you're ready, if you choose to accept me, you'll have a place at my side as my Luna and my queen, not because of what you can give me or what children you might bear, but because you're my mate, my equal, the other half of my soul that I've been missing my entire life." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "And I promise you that I will spend however long it takes proving to you that you're wanted, that you're valued, that you're worth fighting for and protecting and cherishing. Because that's what you deserve, Celine. That's what you've always deserved. And I'm sorry it took so long for someone to see it." 3 years later, Celine stood in the palace medicinal gardens that had become her sanctuary and her pride, the extensive grounds now renowned throughout the Northern Territories as the premier healing center, where wolves came from hundreds of miles away seeking treatment from the moon-blessed Luna, whose gifts with herbs and life magic had saved countless lives and revolutionized werewolf medicine. Her long silver hair, now adorned with small braids woven with silver threads and moonstone beads, fell past her waist as she bent to examine a rare flowering plant that she'd successfully cultivated from seeds brought back from a distant territory, and she smiled as she felt the flutter of movement in her rounded belly. The twins, she carried a tangible reminder that the healers who'd declared her barren had been wrong about everything, that her body had simply been waiting for the right mate to awaken its full potential. Theron found her there, as he often did, appearing in the gardens during breaks from council meetings or diplomatic sessions, drawn to her presence the same way he'd been drawn to her that rainy night in the forest, when he'd opened a cage and found his entire future looking back at him with storm-gray eyes that would later shift to silver in moonlight. "You're supposed to be resting," he said, but there was no real censure in his voice, just fond exasperation mixed with the deep contentment that had characterized their mating from that first moment of recognition. And Celine laughed as she straightened with some difficulty given her advanced pregnancy and turned to face her mate, her king, her partner in building a kingdom that valued compassion and healing as much as strength and power. "The twins are fine, I'm fine, and the gardens need tending because we have 3 new students arriving tomorrow who need to learn proper harvesting techniques for the moon petal flowers," she said, moving into his embrace with the ease of long practice, fitting against his larger frame as though they'd been designed specifically to complement each other, which perhaps they had been. A young Omega approached them hesitantly, recently arrived at the palace after being abandoned by her family for losing her wolf in a tragic accident, and Celine recognized the fear and shame in the girl's eyes because she'd worn that same expression for 8 years, had believed herself fundamentally broken until Theron had shown her that different didn't mean worthless, that perceived flaws were often hidden gifts waiting for the right circumstances to reveal their true nature. Celine took the girl's hands in hers, feeling Theron's supportive presence at her back, and shared her story, the way she'd shared it with dozens of other damaged, discarded, supposedly defective wolves who'd found their way to her doors seeking not just physical healing, but the kind of emotional restoration that came from finally being seen and valued for who they were rather than what they could provide. I was sold by my parents for 30 silver coins because they thought I was infertile and therefore worthless, she said, watching understanding and hope dawn in the young Omega's eyes as she realized she wasn't alone in her pain or her journey toward healing. I spent years believing they were right, that I was broken beyond repair, that I deserved to be caged and sold and discarded. But I was wrong. They were wrong. Everyone who judged my worth by narrow standards that had nothing to do with my actual value as a person was wrong. She squeezed the girl's hands gently, lending strength through touch the way Theron had done for her in that forest clearing when her entire world had shifted on its axis. You are not your tragedy. You are not your loss. You are not the worst thing that ever happened to you. You are a person deserving of love and respect, and the chance to build a life that honors all of who you are, including the parts that others might see as broken, but that might actually be your greatest strengths waiting to be discovered. As the sun set over the palace gardens, painting the sky in shades of silver and gold that echoed the colors of her hair and her mate's eyes, Celine reflected on the journey that had brought her from a cage to a crown, from believing herself worthless to understanding her value was inherent and unchangeable, regardless of others' perceptions. From being sold for the price of a horse to being cherished as a queen and a healer and a living reminder that the moon goddess writes stories in ways mortals can't always predict, but that always, eventually, lead to exactly where we need to be. She thought about her parents sometimes, wondered if they ever regretted their decision to sell their only daughter, if they ever heard the stories about the moon-blessed Luna with silver hair who'd become queen of the Northern Crown, if they understood that their cruelty had been redirected by divine intervention into a path towards something greater than they could have imagined. But mostly, she'd made peace with their choices, recognizing that their inability to see her value said everything about their limitations and nothing about her worth, and that forgiveness didn't require reconciliation, that she could release her anger without inviting them back into her life, that moving forward was sometimes the best revenge against those who'd tried to keep you small. Theron's hand came to rest on her swollen belly, feeling their children move beneath his palm, and Celine leaned back against him with perfect trust, secure in the knowledge that she was loved not for what she could give him, but for who she was, that her mate had chosen her when. She had nothing to offer but her broken, barren, supposedly worthless self, and that choice had transformed both their lives in ways that rippled outward through their entire kingdom, creating a culture that valued compassion over cruelty, healing over harm, and the inherent worth of every person regardless of their perceived usefulness or conformity to narrow definitions of acceptable. The young Omega who'd come seeking help was watching them with an expression that held the first fragile threads of hope. The beginning belief that maybe her story wasn't over, that maybe being broken was just another way of saying she was being prepared for transformation. And Celine smiled at her with understanding, born of lived experience, with the certainty that came from having survived her own darkness and emerged into light, with the knowledge that every wolf who found their way to her gardens carried their own caged past and their own potential for liberation, and that bearing witness to their healing was perhaps the greatest gift her own suffering had given her. The ability to say with absolute conviction that survival was possible, that transformation was achievable, that the moon goddess never abandoned her children, even when it felt like the entire world had turned its back, and the only way forward was through the pain towards something better, waiting on the other side. If you enjoyed Celine and Theron's story of finding love and healing in the most unexpected circumstances, of discovering that what the world labels as broken might actually be a blessing in disguise, of learning that true worth comes from within rather than from others' perceptions or biological functions, please subscribe to this channel for more werewolf romance tales featuring alpha kings, rejected mates, powerful omegas, and the kind of transformative love that proves destiny and choice can work together to create something beautiful from even the darkest beginnings. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload, because every week brings new stories of wolves who overcome impossible odds, find their fated mates, and build lives that honor both their strength and their vulnerability. Leave a comment below telling me what you thought of this story. Which moment resonated most deeply with you? Whether it was Celine's transformation from caged slave to silver queen, Theron's patient courtship and unwavering belief in her worth, or the message that being different isn't the same as being defective. And share what kind of werewolf stories you'd like to see next. Whether you want more Alpha King romances, rejected mate redemptions, or tales of omegas discovering hidden powers that change their destinies. Your support means everything and helps me create more content that explores the beautiful complexity of finding love, healing trauma, and recognizing that sometimes the most precious treasures are the ones others discard because they can't see past surface imperfections to the extraordinary gifts waiting underneath. So thank you for reading. Thank you for being part of this community. And I'll see you in the next story, where another wolf will discover that their worst moment might actually be the beginning of their best life.